As a country by the Gulf of Thailand and in the center of Southeast Asia, the Kingdom of Thailand finds itself at the intersection of regional trading routes. Yet, despite its geopolitical value, the country has yet to establish a modern system of governance. Since the 1930s, Thailand underwent 19 coup attempts, of which 12 were successful. To put it into perspective, that is one coup every 4 years. So to understand the country's cycle of revolutions, we must explore the past and go over the origins of the Thai military government. Welcome to Caspian Report. For ways to support our independent research, check out our crowdfunding platform on patreon.com/Caspian Report. For most of its history, Siam, as it was called, had been embroiled in conflicts with neighboring states over the control of trading routes and geographic advantages. As such, from the 13th century onwards, Thai dynasties formed various states such as the Kingdom of Ayutthaya, Lana, and Chiang Mai. The influx of European traders in the 19th century upended the traditional state of affairs. Drawn by the availability of spices, European powers started establishing trading hubs in the region. For instance, in 1824, the British entered Burma, presently known as Myanmar, and shortly thereafter colonized parts of Malaysia and Singapore in 1826. Meanwhile, the French expanded their influence to the east and colonized parts of Vietnam in 1859, and subsequently acquired oversight of Cambodia in 1863. The arrival of European powers dramatically reduced the influence of the Siam kingdom in the area. To that end, in order to ensure their survival, the Thai rulers had to adjust to the new circumstances. As such, amidst the geopolitical competition in the region, King Mongkut and his son King Chulalongkorn oversaw the rapid westernization and modernization of the kingdom's bureaucracy and society. The educational curriculum was regulated according to European standards. Following the demonstration of British military strength during the Opium Wars with China, King Mongkut of Siam was in no position to reject the British trade interests. Hence, he ceded the nation's taxation on trade in the Bowring Treaty of 1854 to the British. This effectively weakened the monarch's control over the nation and allowed for foreign trade in the kingdom. The succeeding ruler, King Chulalongkorn, continued the modernization mandate, and in an effort to obtain recognition from the French and British, he also sent royal princes to be educated in Europe. Later, in 1897, in face of the escalating geopolitical tensions, King Chulalongkorn visited Europe and sought to improve foreign relations with the European powers. Over the next 4 decades, Siam was under consistent pressure by French Indochina in the east and the British domains that were located to the southwest in Burma, Malaysia, and Singapore. In this framework, the rulers in Paris and London used Siam as a buffer state against one another. The geopolitical situation changed again at the backdrop of World War I. Sensing an opportunity, Siam sided with the French and British empires and declared war on the Central Powers. This act of support allowed for the recognition of Siam as an equal to other European nations. It also ensured the sovereignty of the kingdom, as it became the only country in Southeast Asia to have successfully resisted colonization by European powers. However, Siam's triumph proved to be short-lived. After obtaining favor with London and Paris, the post-World War I economic depression of 1990 hit Siam, which was closely followed by the Great Depression of 1929. Both catastrophes affected the kingdom enormously. The prices of property and rice fell by more than 50%, and besides the economic fallout, social unrest accelerated as the Thai people became disenfranchised from their initial hopes of modernization. At the same time, the advances in foreign education, which had been advocated by the rulers, had also given birth to a new middle class that was increasingly demanding more from the government. In 1927, a group of Western-educated students known as the Promoters, formed the People's Party and sought to change the governance of Siam and in the process further modernize the country. As such, the group put their plan in motion, which manifested in the Siamese Revolution of 1932. A group of 114 individuals, which included military and cultural leaders, rejected the notion of an absolute monarchy in favor of a constitutional monarchy. The reigning leader, King Prajadipok, submitted to the coup and allowed the legal transformation of the kingdom, which ended nearly 8 centuries of absolute monarchy. As extensive as the Siamese Revolution was, 2 additional coups occurred in 1933. The first was led by Colonel Prayapahon and occurred shortly after he withdrew from the new government due to a disagreement concerning socialist-based economic reforms. Prayapahon's coup witnessed the rise of the military faction in the government as it prevailed over the civilian authority. When the dust settled down, the colonel elevated himself as the new prime minister and the commander of the royal army. What's more is that Prayapahon sought the king's endorsement, but whether his actions were approved before or after the coup is uncertain. Either way, the king's endorsement of the overthrow would set a precedent for future revolutions. However, not everyone was thrilled with Prayapahon's new military government. Thus, a few months later, a reactionary group led by Prince Bovoradet sought to restore the balance of power in favor of the monarchy. Despite the initial success, the Bovoradet rebellion was defeated by the new military government. As such, the royalist faction within the country was greatly weakened. By the end of the war, Prayapahon had secured his political position, and although the king's office was unaffected, a strong nationalist military mandate was instilled in the government. In the following years, one military commander benefited particularly from the new political arrangement. Plak Phibansonkram, better known as Phibin, had participated in the Siamese Revolution of 1932 and the Bovoradet Rebellion. In 1938, Phibin had replaced Prayapahon as the prime minister and the military commander of the kingdom. As a zealous modernizer, he utilized his dictatorial powers to change the country's name from Siam to Thailand. Phibin also decreed a number of cultural mandates that adjusted the traditional flag, calendar, customs, clothing, and more. In the following years, at the backdrop of the Cold War, Thailand was dominated by a series of military dictators in which one despot was replaced by another. Military dictatorships were not unique to Thailand, nor was the country isolated from the spreading ideals of communism. As geopolitical tensions escalated with the communist government in neighboring Vietnam, the authorities in Bangkok allied themselves with Washington. Yet an even greater threat was about to occur at home. Rapid modernization and westernization eventually forced the military government to enact a new constitution in 1968, which resulted in democratic elections in February 1969. The military's political faction, led by Field Marshal Tanom, won the elections and secured 35% of the seats. Since the military achieved a majority, it managed to retain all key positions. However, the electoral expectations frustrated the society. Students who were influenced by modernization efforts were particularly unhappy with the absolute power of the military. In time, discontent culminated in the Thai Popular Uprising of 1973, when a group of students were detained for distributing political flyers. The military government responded by enacting a new decree that banned the gathering of more than 5 people, which is a law that still is in existence. The bill, however, had the opposite effect. In October 1973, a crowd of more than 1,000 students of the Thammasat University protested against the actions of the government. Within days, the crowd grew to a staggering 400,000 people from all segments of the society. The overwhelming pressure forced the military government to relent and implement a new constitution within a year. However, the compromise did not appease the students and the protesters, who decided to march towards the palace of the Thai ruler, King Bhumibol Adulyadej. In the days leading up to the march, the king had engaged in talks with both sides. Yet, despite his efforts, the situation spiraled out of control when a canister of tear gas was fired into the protesting crowd. Immediately following this, riots erupted and the military responded excessively. In the aftermath of the violence, at least 75 civilians had died. The violence marked the end of Field Marshal Thanom's political prospects. As the military government collapsed under its own weight, all key ministers, including Thanom himself, left Thailand in a self-imposed exile. The victory of the democratic movement redefined the political landscape of Thailand. Yet, the success of the democratic uprising did not last. By 1976, the military re-established control through a violent coup, which resulted in the Thammasat University massacre. In the following years, over the course of the 1980s, Thailand was ruled by General Prem Tinsul Anonda. Although Prem came from the military faction, he held democratic views on governance. He basically returned the legislative bodies to civilian control in service of the citizens of Thailand. As Prime Minister, Prem supervised over the country's longest experience of democracy, which lasted from the 1980s to 2005, with small exceptions of brief coups that occurred in 1991 and 1992. However, the cycle of coups picked up steam again in 2006, when riots broke out against the government and the military stepped in. Although civilian control was eventually restored, another overthrow occurred in May 2014, which has lasted to this day. The current status quo concerning the military government somewhat changed following the death of King Bhumibol Adulyadej, who ruled Thailand for the past 70 years. Immediately following Maha Vajiralongkorn's ascension to the throne, the military transferred 5 state agencies that were managed by the military to the new king. Furthermore, in July 2017, King Vajiralongkorn obtained full control of the Thai Crown Property Bureau, which holds assets estimated up to $60 billion in value. On the other hand, the general elections that were scheduled for 2017 have been pushed back to 2018 due to an amended constitution that was signed into law by the new king. In addition to this, the military government has put forth several provisions for it to relinquish power. The 2 most interesting conditions stipulate that the military will retain veto power in the upper house of Thailand until 2022, and that 250 pro-military members of the parliaments also retain the right to select a prime minister of their choice. Although there have been consistent calls for the current military government to return legislative powers back to the organs of the state and to relinquish their authority, at the present, Thailand is officially a military dictatorship. Nevertheless, what is different this time is that King Vajiralongkorn, unlike his predecessor, has been actively participating in the politics of Thailand, thereby potentially altering the usual cycle of power. The effects of this new relationship remains to be seen. What is certain, however, is that it will not take long before the next coup erupts. This Caspian report was made possible in collaboration with Yong from Singapore. Also, special thanks to our contributors on Patreon who give us the means to retain our independent research. And if you want to be part of that process, or if you're searching for additional perks, check out our crowdfunding page on patreon.com/Caspian Report. For now, thank you for your time and Sarol.